Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
Hey guys, I'm Lawrence, and welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior, the podcast that shows you how to get the most out of your high-intensity training and start and grow your strength training business. My former guests include the who's who in high-intensity training. People like Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Bay, and Jim Flanagan. Paleo pioneers Mark Sisson and Rob Wolf. Successful strength training entrepreneurs like Luke Carlson, Adam Zickerman, Roger Schwab. Sports scientists, high-intensity bodybuilders, high-intensity training case studies, and everything in between. My guest today is Dr. Jeremy Loenneke, who joins me for a part 2 on the podcast. Jeremy is an assistant professor of exercise science at the University of Mississippi within the School of Applied Sciences. He obtained his PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Oklahoma and has previously earned a master's degree in nutrition and exercise science from Southeast Missouri State University. His research focuses on skeletal muscle adaptations to exercise with and without the application of blood flow restriction. You can tweet Jeremy over on Twitter, obviously, at JP Loenneke. That's JPLOENNEKE. That's probably the best place to contact Jeremy. In this episode, we cover the most important metrics to focus on for optimizing muscular growth, why single sets are probably just as effective as multiple sets, why the majority of adults may be plateauing in muscle growth after just 3 months of training, and much, much more. This was a really in-depth, if not the most in-depth episode I've done on the subject of how to stimulate maximal muscle growth and how to think about developing muscle over the long term. Look, a lot of the opinions in this episode aren't going to be very popular. I do stay grounded when it comes to expectations around, what can be achieved in terms of optimizing muscle mass. I think there's a lot of bullshit online, and I'm sure you guys are aware of that, in terms of people kind of promising or making false promises and just not really interpreting the science that well when it comes to communicating to people what can be achieved in terms of muscle growth. And I think, Jeremy is certainly an exception to that. He is a very, very well-respected scientist in the field of skeletal muscle adaptation. And I just found this to be a very, very refreshing and useful conversation. Certainly one of my most progressive episodes on the topic to date. And that's it, guys. So sit back, enjoy. And now I give you Dr. Jeremy Loenneke. Jeremy, welcome back to Corporate Warrior.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
You are most welcome. Really excited to talk to you again. As I was saying before we went online there, I've been listening to our part 1 and, kind of listening to it going, that's actually quite a good interview because, as I was saying, I'm my own biggest critic. But at the same time, it's interesting, like that was published in May 2017. And when I listened to it back, now I understand a lot of what you were trying to tell me. Whereas back then I was a bit like, no, I don't get it, Jeremy. So that was quite nice to know that I've actually got a tiny bit smarter, hopefully. So a few things I wanted to focus on mostly in this episode. So like muscle growth and strength and muscle soreness and periodization and things like that. Just to really understand, what you've how you've changed your mind on some of those things since we last spoke, some of the recent research, that type of thing. Something I wanted to, so a lot of these were sort of stimulated from our first conversation. And the one I wanted to start with is this concept of trying to obtain, optimal muscle growth. And I'm trying to think of another word to use rather than optimal, but I can't think of one right now. And you were describing to me when we first spoke how, you used to think that so long as you're getting stronger, that's going to result also in muscle hypertrophy. And then you realize that actually strength gains were only associated and not causative. So with that in mind, I just wondered, when you recommend people train for optimal muscle growth or for improving muscle growth, what metrics should we be focused on? What's the most important metric there, or metrics?
Yeah, for muscle growth, and I think the kind of my thinking was a little bit actually reversed in the sense of muscle growth being important for changing strength. But I think with muscle growth, I think that a lot of the literature really seems like it's coming down to how much effort you're able to apply within an exercise bout. Meaning that if you're taking the exercise, at or pretty close to failure, and you're doing that maybe a couple sets, I don't think you need a tremendous amount. I think that's probably going to be enough to stimulate and probably maximize muscle growth for the majority of people. And I think if you do, 3 to 4 sets in an kind of an exercise session, I'm pretty sure that's going to be a pretty strong stimulus for growth, especially if you're going to failure. With respect to strength, I think that strength being defined as kind of increasing your 1 RM, so the 1 repetition maximum, I think that's going to be heavily dependent upon training close to or near the 1 RM. I think you can obviously see increases in 1 RM training with 30%, 40% to failure, but usually not quite as high of an increase as you do as you get closer to that test.
Okay, got it. Just going back to what you were saying there about recommendations for, few sets to failure, like you said, there are probably going to be enough in terms of inducing that response, and that effort is the primary thing. And I've heard Dr. James Steele and James Fisher talk about that a lot, which is interesting to that you have a similar view there. Now, are you potentially saying there, and I know we touched on this before, so apologies if I'm going over old ground a little bit, but are you kind of saying that, maybe a single set to muscular failure, and I know maybe this perhaps will differ on different exercises, is perhaps not as effective as actually doing multiple sets to failure?
Yeah, I think it really probably depends on the exercise. And I'm just speculating, but my guess is for a lot of the single joint movements, I'm sure that 1 set's probably giving you a lot of the signal that you probably need. But I think if you want to be just, sure about it, if you do 2 or 3, I'm pretty sure that's maximal. I think when you start doing a little more complex movements where you have more muscle groups that are actually involved, maybe you need a little bit more sets. I don't think you need 10 or 12 sets in an exercise session, but I think there's probably times where doing more than 1 set's probably a little bit better. But I think that 1 set, for the most part, can give you a pretty big bang for your buck.
Yeah, I suppose what our last conversation and what you're saying there is kind of leading me to believe is that actually, if you want to optimize this outcome, then maybe it makes sense to try and make it so that you are hitting your muscle groups directly as often, in every week, as opposed to having, like, for instance, if you were to do a very, very abbreviated workout routine that's focused mostly on compound movements, you might struggle to actually stimulate those muscles directly. So it might make more sense for you to, if you wanted to limit the volume in a particular session and split it up, but make sure that you're doing a combination of single joint and multi-joint exercises to optimize that stimulus and those outcomes. Is that, I don't know if I've just kind of confused you there, but is that, yeah, go on.
I think that's fair to say. I think that's, I think with muscle growth, I think the recommendation, at least for me, and I think that, I don't think that a lot of people would disagree with it. I think that it really comes down to a lot of personal preference. And I think that you can do a lot, assuming you do enough of it, and stimulate a lot of growth. And I think that for most people, if all they're doing is compound movements, maybe putting in some isolation so you don't have to do quite as many sets. But I think you could still do compounds and still stimulate maximal growth. I just think the strategy might be a little bit different. But I think what you said is probably fair, yes.
Now, that's very interesting, and something that I perhaps will think about in my own workouts a bit more. I know you spoke about when I spoke to James Steele, I think it was probably last year, he mentioned your study, or a study you were involved in, called Muscle Growth to Infinity and Beyond. And I was just keen to. I was trying to read that, and I couldn't find the full paper. And I just wondered if you might be able to elaborate, if you can remember. I know it's probably way back for you. Just in terms of like what that means, in terms of when people actually do plateau and when they stop seeing any real appreciable muscle growth, and then also the type of growth they might expect thereafter.
Yeah, I think that the paper that you're describing is a review paper, not really a study. It's kind of a narrative review of several studies. But no, I think the kind of the general point is that at some point your ability to respond to an exercise stimulus is going to diminish to where you're probably not going to be making any appreciable increases in muscle size. And for me, I think that's pretty obvious when you look around to anyone in the gym that's been training for any amount of time. Now, I don't want to say that people can't increase muscle size beyond a certain point, but I do think that the response is so small that you probably aren't going to appreciably be able to detect any change in muscle size. But I think that when people start lifting weights, and this seems to differ a little bit on muscle group, but I think just speaking overall, I think that most people see changes in muscle size when lifting as an adult pretty quickly. And I think that you have a pretty good idea of what you're going to be pretty early on into your training. Meaning, assuming you're doing, you have an appropriate training protocol, which you're training at or near failure to stimulate growth. I think that most people are going to most adults, rather, are going to have, I'd say, the majority of what they're going to have in the first few months of exercise. Now, I'm not saying that when people keep lifting weights beyond that they don't see some type of increase. But relative to what you see early on into your training program, it's very, very, very small. And I think that beyond 3 months or so, I would guess that the majority of people are plateauing. Now, a lot of people disagree with that, and that's okay. I just don't think that adults consistently increase muscle size as much as people proclaim they do every single year. To me, it doesn't make sense physiologically at all that would be able to occur. I think some people kind of get a little confused, and this is myself too, because I think back to when I started lifting weights, and I'm certainly bigger than I was after my first 3 months of exercise, but I also started lifting weights when I was 16 years old. So I think that we have to keep in mind that during different periods of development, that might be a completely different story. But I think with adults who are in their, maybe if you take someone who's in their early to mid 20s and they start lifting weights, I think that they have a pretty good idea of what adaptations they're going to get with respect to muscle growth pretty early on. And I think that they're going to have a good idea of what they are in the first few months of exercise, meaning I don't think that anyone's kind of been training for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and they stay pretty steady, and then all of a sudden they start growing massively, and turn into kind of Ronnie Coleman or Mr. Olympia. That doesn't happen. So I think that the majority of what people are going to get happens pretty early on.
And what about when people talk about advanced trainees and gaining like a pound a year, which I have absolutely no interest in that type of pursuit. But is that true? Is that the case in terms of because you mentioned that gains beyond the initial kind of few months or 6 months or what have you are even hard to detect. So what's your take on that?
I think with measuring muscle size, I think it's hard to detect. I think it's pretty evident that this is a very difficult thing to study, and especially in a research setting. So, to be honest, I think that we're trading speculation for speculation, because the majority of laboratory studies are in the maybe 3 or 4 months at the longest, and there are some that are 1 to 2 years, but there's not very many of those. And they have a lot of breaks in between for vacations and things like that. So I think it's very difficult to have that conversation and say science says this, because I think the counter to that is where is that science? And I think that it's going to be hard to do those studies. But I think when someone says they gain a pound a year, I totally believe that. I mean, I think that people gain lots of pounds or kilograms, whatever unit you want to use. But is that all muscle size? Is that all muscle mass? I don't think so. That's my opinion. So it's not to say that some of it couldn't be muscle mass, but certainly I don't think people are gaining a pound every year of muscle mass. But I think that it's, you have to keep that in. I think you have to kind of understand that with the nuance that there's not a lot of data on that. But I think you can pull some things from some of the shorter term studies that are like 9 months, where people change at 3 months and maybe they don't change a whole lot after. Not that they couldn't change some, but probably not gaining a pound every year.
And this kind of also brings me on to talking about the concept that you hear thrown around all the time, which is progressive overload. Which, as my understanding, is that means to obviously increase resistance over time with a view to improve your outcomes in terms of strength and muscle gain. I remember previous guests sort of saying, I don't really think there's any research behind that. And I think, so long as you're training with a high degree of effort, that actually progressive overload won't yield any greater gains than just training with, high degree of effort and training close or to failure. And obviously that's a controversial thing to say, because progressive overload is such a prevalent term or concept in training, and aside from like maybe making a workout a little shorter because you're using heavier loads and therefore your repetition range or time under load is shorter, is there any real reason to progressively overload?
I see what you're saying. I think that I think you can. I get all the criticism of progressive overload, and I think you could criticize it as you explained it. But I think that some people would also suggest that there's probably maybe two other ways to progress the overload, or two other ways to implement progressive overload, meaning one, as you described, you could increase the load. So if I'm doing 3 sets of 10 at 70%, as I get stronger, I just increase the load for 3 sets of 10. Now, I think that's incredibly limited because strength plateaus pretty quickly as well. So at some point, if you don't have some other way to progress, then your ability to respond is going to be reduced. But I think that you can also progress exercise by increasing the sets per session, or increasing the number of repetitions, or even increasing the frequency that you're training each muscle group per week. To me, that is another form of progressive overload. So I think when people are doing sets to failure or high effort, I think that as they get stronger or as they improve strength endurance, I think that they end up doing more repetitions. So I think that some might argue that actually is a form of progressive overload.
Right. And so, but I guess the only reason you would do that is because you can, or because you're able to, because you have the strength and the endurance, perhaps that's improved. And in the context of increasing resistance, it would just be to reach failure within a shorter time frame. Is that what we're looking for when we implement any form of progressive overload?
Well, I think it depends on your outcome. I think if for muscle strength, if you're not progressing the load, then you're really not going to be progressing strength.
Yeah.
But muscle hypertrophy, I think it's a great question. And I think that if you have someone, I think you've just described the potential study design. So if you have someone, they train for a week and then you take the average of the, their high effort sets, and let's just say they do, one set of 30, and that's failure, and that stimulates growth. As they get better, they could probably do 40 reps, 50 reps. But if they kept doing 30, which was their high effort initially, would they still see progressive changes in muscle size? I don't know. But I think that's kind of what you're getting at. I think that if you just go to failure, then you account for all of those potential variables.
Pretty much. That's kind of what I'm suggesting or speculating. But
I think it's a great question. And I think that I've kind of thrown it around the lab a little bit myself. And I don't know that I actually believe that people would consistently get increases if they didn't keep going to failure. But I think my students would largely think that that doesn't make sense, that you should, as you get more strength and endurance, you should do more work. Otherwise, you're probably going to stagnate over time. But I think I don't know of a study that's done that. It could have been, but I don't know off the top of my head. But I think it's an interesting idea for sure.
Cool. I'm going to stop there on that tangent, and otherwise I might just end up confusing myself. We talked a little bit about periodization last time we spoke, and I was recently at the Resistance Exercise Conference in Minneapolis, and I saw Dr. James Fisher, talk about periodization not really being that key in terms of, well, he reviewed two studies, which I can't remember the details of now, but basically it didn't seem like periodization in a regime to that focused on muscle growth was really that important. And I know I believe you think about that in a similar way. What is your most up-to-date kind of thinking around periodization in the context of a training regime for producing optimal muscle growth?
I think when you talk about muscle growth, I just don't see any utility to it at all. And I want to caveat that with it. It's perfectly acceptable to set up your training program in some periodized way. I could see where people like it because sometimes it can offer some different ways to approach training. You're switching variables every once in a while. So I understand why people do it, and that's fine. They certainly can. But that's very different from making the statement that it's required, or even that it augments the response. Meaning that if you don't do periodization, maybe you'll get some gains, but it won't be quote unquote optimal. I disagree with that statement, and I think that there's really it's a baseless statement in my opinion. So I think that people certainly can use periodization, and if they want to, and that's great, do that. But to say that because you like it, that it's somehow superior or even necessary for optimal adaptation is a completely different story. And I think if you look at the literature behind it, I think that it's tough because the majority of the studies aren't actually imaging muscle. So meaning that when you compare periodization and non-periodization, and you're using underwater weighing or DEXA or skin folds or some way to estimate gross lean body mass, I think that when you look at those studies with periodized versus non-periodized, some studies show that both groups increase. Periodization is a little bit more. Some studies, probably equal numbers, suggest that both of them are the same, or even maybe the non-periodized is a little bit better. But overall, when you look at lean body mass, I think it's you have some studies show a little bit benefit of periodization. Other studies show no benefit. But I think if you actually look at studies that image the muscle, and granted there's not very many, they show no benefit to periodization. And I think that if you think physiologically about how muscle growth changes, I just don't know why kind of making volume and intensity undulate over time, I don't know why that would lead to differences in muscle growth based on how muscle growth is thought to change. And I think that if you're maximally signaling a muscle to grow, I think a maximal stimulus, whether it's periodized or it's non-periodized. So I think that with respect to muscle growth, I see no relevance to periodization at all, unless that's how you just like to set up your training. Then more power to you. But I think that we have to move away from this line of thinking, because it's no different than what people do with diets. And the people can recognize it when other people do it with diets. It's like, well, you like ketogenic diet, but that doesn't mean that it's somehow superior. You just like it. But it's the same line of thinking with periodization for muscle hypertrophy. You like it, so do it. But that doesn't mean that it's somehow superior, in my opinion.
I love that. Yeah, I totally agree. And I do just think sometimes that, when I hear periodization concepts and strategies for optimizing muscle growth, I just think it's like, why are you overcomplicating it? You know, that's what I think when I see that. And I should also add, I remember, you know, just to give the James more context when he presented on this, is that he said exactly what you just said, which is, you know what, it probably doesn't lead to greater gains, but if your clients, because obviously most of the room were strength training entrepreneurs, he's like, if your clients would respond better or have greater compliance or just enjoy their workouts more, then go for it, because you know what, it's probably not going to make a huge difference in the long run. was I think one of his kind of points, takeaway points. Yeah, sorry, go on. Yeah,
say one more thing about that.
Sure.
Because I'm interested in the idea of variation, and I think that what he kind of described, I think I'd agree with. So physiologically, is there really any benefit to undulating these variables to periodized models for optimal growth? I can't think of a single reason why that would be the case. But long term, if you're working with a client for long term, is there some just utility psychologically to doing something a little bit different? You know, that maybe physiologically it doesn't do anything more, better. But psychologically, if you're training someone for the next 6 years, you're really going to have them do the same thing every day. So I definitely see, but is that periodization? I think it's just, so I don't know. I just think that physiologically, I can't see any relevance at all. But psychologically, whether you want to call it periodization or whatever you want to call it, doing something a little bit different from time to time, that makes some sense to me for long-term compliance.
Yeah, completely agree. Definitely having some variation over the lifetime of your training career is seems to be beneficial. There are a few exceptions where I hear people literally do the same routines for decades, but I don't think I slide into that category. I saw a screenshot, Jeremy, I think it was on Twitter, of you presenting at the ACSM at the end of this month. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah. And I saw the title of your presentation. Now, I know you probably can't give away much of the meat on a podcast that's, 10 days before, or just around 10 days. But I have to probe and have to ask anyway. So, the title of your presentation is The Importance of Frequency for Muscle Hypertrophy, Evidence-Based or Wishful Thinking. Now, when we spoke in May 2017, you said there might be something to increased frequency, in terms of optimizing muscle growth. So, again, it might be, light of what we just spoke about earlier. It might be, when we're splitting hairs so much, it doesn't really matter. But can you give us any kind of, trailer or insight into what you'll be talking about?
Sure. So that's, I think that it's one of those topics that, again, needs maybe some additional research to really know. But I think that, to me, the frequency story, the frequency hypothesis is really interesting. And I really kind of like the hypothetical nature of why it would be better. And I think if you look at Brad Schoenfeld has a meta-analysis on this. And when you look at the studies that made the final cut into the actual analysis, there does appear to be maybe a slight advantage to doing higher frequency, meaning how many days per week or how many sessions per week you're training each muscle group. So I think that there's a slight benefit, but I think it's pretty small. And I think that there could be a variety of reasons that might be able to see greater changes with higher frequency. Maybe if we had a greater differential between studies, meaning some of the studies, there's not really a big difference between the groups, meaning that the low frequency group's training 2 days per week. The high frequency group is 3 days per week. So that's not a big differential there. So that, I think that's part of the issue with a lot of the frequency work. And I think one of the other ones goes back similar to some of the periodization studies, meaning that there's not a lot of studies that actually measure muscle size. A lot of them are making gross estimates of lean mass, which is okay, but I think we have to keep that in mind. And I think we also have to keep in mind just kind of this idea of this frequency hypothesis that, a lot of people have discussed. We've written about it. We published about it. I think that the theory per se behind it is pretty sound. But I think that you also have to keep in mind that there's only so much the muscle can respond. So while it may be this beautiful idea, and maybe it does give you a slight advantage, I think if there's any advantage to it, it's just pretty small based on the current evidence.
Yeah, so let's put that into context. So let's say you've been training for a year with a high degree of effort and doing what we've been talking about and probably what we went over in part 1 as well. And I'll link to that all in the show notes. And then you switch to a higher frequency. I mean, is it worth it? Are you going to get greater gains in terms of the time investment and other sacrifices you might make to increase your training frequency? Is it really worth it?
Right. And I think that, one of the other ideas that I am excited about, that we present in the paper and I'll be presenting in the talk is, what do you do when you get to super high frequency? Where do you go from there? And we propose kind of this idea of maybe you can decrease the frequency over time to where maybe you lose a little bit of muscle size, but you resensitize the muscle, meaning you make a trained muscle respond as if it was naive to exercise. Now, I think it's very important that your listeners understand that is massive speculation, but I think it's an interesting idea that has really limited data behind it. And I think you have to base that kind of in, or at least consider the last statement that you made is, if you do get a little bit of a change, is it worth it? Is it worth all that extra time? And is it even appreciable? Meaning that maybe we can detect it with some of our measurements, but does it actually do anything worthwhile?
Yeah, and I appreciate you explaining that, because I think there's a lot of research out there, a lot of research regarding training frequency, and I think, to be frank, I just think a lot of my listeners and even some of the people in the fitness industry that probably should just don't make the time or find the time to read all of the research. So they might read some and then they try and kind of bridge that gap by listening to a show like this where they can hear your interpretation, which is obviously an interpretation. And it's why not trying to say that you're not saying anything that's not accurate, Jeremy, but it's like the source is always probably where people should try. And if they want to get closer to the truth, right, it's go to the source. Right. But I just find it almost impractical for a lot of the practitioners to be all over the research, like obviously you guys are. So just to kind of wrap up this section on muscle growth, because I know I'm probably, I know sometimes I feel like I'm not really being as productive because I don't know whether any of these variables really make a huge difference. But when it comes to getting, shall we say, the rest in speech marks, if you've been training for a number of years and you're just I want to try and eke out that last bit of muscle growth, you've mentioned frequency there potentially might. But, is it detectable? Who knows? Are there any other recommendations that you have? Just because I know a lot of people listening to this are really keen to understand if they can increase muscle growth further, perhaps.
Yeah, well, the answer is, can you increase it forever? I just can't imagine that that's the case. But I think beyond frequency, I'm not sure what else you could do that's not, illegal. But I think that one of the things that you could do, especially as you become more trained, I think some people could probably maintain a lot of what they have on maybe doing a little bit less. So maybe increasing the frequency was important to eke it out a little bit more, but maybe you can actually maintain some of it or the majority of it by even cutting your frequency back down. But I think that once people have been training for a few years and they have a lot of other things going on, I think the best case is to just try and go in there and do some sets to failure and then just try to maintain across life under the kind of the assumption that maintaining muscle mass over time is important.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think I remember someone mentioned that you tweeted, I think it's James Steele mentioned that you did a tweet a long time ago, and it just made me laugh so much. And it was something along the lines of, what's the best thing I've learned about optimizing muscle growth is just to grow up, or something like that.
Yeah, I think that the greatest gains you see in muscle size are when you're not really doing anything. You're just growing. You're just developing from a baby to adulthood. You gain a tremendous amount. And obviously that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek comment, but I think that it's just trying to illustrate that as an adult, relatively speaking, you're not gaining a tremendous amount on average.
Yeah, it's quite. I find that actually quite liberating to hear that, because that's as much as we know in terms of the research, and I think a lot of people, and this, are just obsessed with trying to find the magic bullet, or they're questioning, like they look at themselves and they're really questioning whether or not what they're doing is working for them, and then some guru tells them they should do this protocol over here, and yeah. That's not what the science is really saying at this point. And the sooner that people can actually become more comfortable in their own skin and just realize that not everyone has the genetics to put on a lot of muscle mass, then the better off everyone will be, is the way I see it.
That's true. And I think that depending on your mindset, I think a lot of people in the gym, they may actually train better if they go in there with even though they know that this can't go on forever, I think with respect to just changing adaptation. But I think that if you have the mindset of, I'm going to keep pushing the limit, I can, I understand that makes sense to have that mindset, that maybe you can have continual improvement, even if you can't. I get having that mindset. But I think that, as you said, we have to ground in what are we discussing? Are we discussing what actually happens, or what you need to kind of motivate you to train?
Yeah, that's a really important point, because it's funny, like I can sit here and say all this stuff with you and listen to you, but like I will go into my workout in 2 days' time with like this mindset of I'm going to grow, and I'm gonna like put on 5 pounds after this workout, and it's obviously complete bullshit, but it's something about that. It's like as soon as you say, "Oh, I can't improve anymore," I personally, and I think a lot of people could probably relate to this, it would definitely affect my motivation to work out of a high degree of effort.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think there's probably a lot of people with that same mindset, myself included. I mean, there's probably a point where I'm not going to get any stronger, and I think that I've probably reached that. But I work out under the assumption that at some point I'm going to get stronger. Otherwise, why would I be in the gym? But I think other people, it might actually be useful for them, because maybe they're working hard, but they don't see changes as much anymore. But if they know that, well, maybe there's still some benefit even if I'm not changing. Maybe there's benefit to maintaining. Maybe that will actually help them instead of cripple them. But I think it might just depend on your mindset. But I think overall, I think it's important to note that just your ability to change, I just don't see how it would be infinite. And I don't think there's any evidence that it is infinite. So I think it's very finite, all these adaptations. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that.
Yeah, well said. Last time we spoke, we were talking about strength. And at the end of the episode, you mentioned how you thought that quite often people's baseline strength was getting confused with the exercise-induced strength in terms of reducing all-cause mortality. Do you remember? I don't know if you remember talking about that, but am I making sense with that intro to that?
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying. I think that it's a very confusing topic to discuss, because I don't think it's necessarily intuitive. But I think that when you discuss baseline strength, and it's the same argument with muscle size and strength. Baselines, they can't tell you anything about a training response. So someone's baseline strength. So when we look at, for example, the analysis in question is one we published on strength and the behavior of muscle strengthening activities and how that relates to all-cause mortality. And what you see is, and it's true, if you look at muscle strengthening activities, which is the behavior, it is correlated favorably with all-cause mortality, meaning that those who participate tend to have better health outcomes. But when you account for strength, when you put strength into the model, it pretty much is the most important factor. And it has nothing to do with muscle strengthening activities, because the majority of the people in our analysis that were in the top, they weren't participating in strengthening activities, meaning it was the outcome, not the behavior. So I think the greater point is that we have to be careful when you see people sharing studies and they go, look at this. This is strength is favorably associated with this. And then they go, see, this is evidence that we should be lifting weights.
Yeah.
And maybe that's true, but you can't make that claim off of that study, because that study is on an outcome, not on the engagement in lifting weights. And those are two very different things. And in my opinion, it's the outcome, which is typically more important than the behavior typically associated with that outcome. And that's going to confuse everyone. And I apologize in advance.
I'm sort of confused, but also sort of understand. So I'm quite happy with that. But does that mean that basically we need more research to figure out if exercise-induced strength improvement can actually improve this marker of health?
Right. And I think that what we'd find is that an exercise-induced improvement in this probably is associated with some change in some biomarker. And you can view that as a favorable change or whatever your mindset is. But I think that it would pale in comparison to probably just someone being strong at baseline. And I think that's just tells you an inherent difference between people. But I don't know. But yeah, of course, more research is always important, especially when we start talking about the health outcomes of exercise. So, meaning, are we changing biomarkers associated with health, or are we actually changing health? And that's a quick way to lose friends in exercise science.
Yeah. Yeah. And also just acutely aware that we've spent so much time on muscle growth when actually health is probably the most important thing in all of this. Do you know what? It just occurred to me, like, you know, maybe it's so interesting, you know, if a lot of people are obviously just genetically strong, have a high level of baseline strength. And I was trying to think about, okay, why does that make people more robust or have greater longevity? And I'm guessing, we may be going outside of your expertise now, Jeremy, I'm not sure, but like, is that related to the fact that if you're stronger, whether it's exercise-induced or genetic, then does that mean that anything that you basically do is less effort and therefore puts less demand on the supporting systems of the body, like the cardiovascular system? Do you think that's why these people are, you know, have a reduced all-cause mortality?
I don't know. I think that we have to be very careful with those analyses, making claims like that, because I think that you have to. I think it's just an overall marker of just health and just. But I think just extrapolating beyond that, I think which is what many of us do, I think can get us into some trouble. So the short answer is I don't know.
No, I appreciate your honesty, and it's just something that I thought might be logical, but yeah, obviously no proof to that. You know, last time we also spoke about muscle soreness, which, you know, again, is something that you were very honest about and saying, you know, I don't think there's any science to say, or at least when we spoke about it back then, to say what really causes. Like, we know there's a lot of association with training and muscle soreness, but we don't know what actually causes it. Is there any further research or any developments there that you've come across or produced yourself on that at all?
Not really. I mean, I think the kind of the reason why I'm even thinking about this in general is with a lot of our blood flow restriction protocols, I think other people who take biopsies and they look at them, there's not a lot of structural damage to the fiber. So maybe, you know, I think the traditional story is there's micro tears or whatever. But I think when we look at we don't look at it, but when other people look at the fiber, they don't see a lot of structural changes following blood flow restricted exercise, meaning it doesn't really damage or doesn't destroy the fiber as you might see under high force eccentric lengthening actions or whatever. But we see a lot of people that are pretty sore following those exercise bouts. And I'm just curious as to why. And to be honest, it's not my area to understand pain or anything like that. But I think the the go-to answer that we always have is micro tears. And I just don't know that that's that convincing to me. You micro tears. So I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but does that really correlate to these, or does that really cause this soreness? And to be honest, I have no idea. But I've been talking to some people at a conference I was at a couple months ago, or maybe it was a month ago, who do some pain stuff, and I didn't understand a lot of what they were saying. They were getting pretty mechanistic pretty quickly, but I think the pain thing is very interesting, and I don't know enough to really speak out too much about it.
Yeah, because it kind of occurred to me that it might be, and I'm even more ignorant on this than you might be. It kind of occurred to me that it might be more, like you say, it's a pain, mindset related thing. Maybe more, the kind of question can be answered better in the neuroscience fields. Do you think it's more likely to be related to that than
I
local?
think it's interesting. I mean, you exercise you do it one time. You come back and you do the same thing, and you're less sore. Why? That's just interesting to me. I mean, that's a really, that's a really kind of consistent finding, the repeated bout effect. But I've just never been, maybe those explanations are convincing for other people. They're just not convincing to me. It doesn't mean that they're not right. I just have a hard time kind of wrapping my head around that. I just find it fascinating.
Yeah, because I was thinking about you the other day because, I do, one of my routines is like a body weight routine. I do like chin-ups and push-ups and single-legged squats and stuff like that at home. And I'm following something called Project Kratos, which is a body weight training program written by Drew Bay, who's a high-intensity training advocate. And it's quite cool because it's got a progression system in there where rather than adding loads or adding more weight, you're making the exercise more difficult. And so, for instance, I'd be doing like a full range chin up, and then last workout I did like a partial range, so just like the top half of the chin up with at the full contraction top, like a really hard squeeze of the lats and the biceps. And the idea is that it gets harder, and the time under load or rep range goes down, and then you continue to kind of improve your performance week on week or over time. And the next day I woke up with an immense amount of soreness in kind of my where my bicep insertion is on both arms, so around my kind of elbow joint. And I just thought like, I made that very tiny change to I say tiny, it's and how you look at it. I made that change to my protocol, and I'm getting sore from that. And obviously that's the same for whenever you change your workout protocol, right? We can all say anecdotally that that's what, we know we're going to be sore when we do a completely new set of exercises, which is fascinating. And it's frustrating that we can't exactly say why that's happening, but it's still a mystery, right? There's no answer to that at the moment.
I mean, at least to me it is. I mean, unless somebody has done something, but they always tag the party line. Oh, it's the micro tears. I don't know about that. I mean, like I said, maybe that's the case. I just find it interesting. One bout of exercise, and you do the same bout and you're less sore. I just find that kind of an interesting finding.
Okay, so more work to be done, it sounds. Awesome. So, Jeremy, what other kind of research have you done recently? What other findings have come up for you lately? Anything that you think would be interesting to bring up at this point?
Yeah, I think right now we just finished up several studies. I don't want to speak too much about it, but kind of looking at very, very low loads. So I think that we're kind of trying to answer some of these questions related to blood flow restriction, so low loads versus low loads without blood flow restriction. So, for example, if we look at a kind of a low to moderate loading pattern of like 30% 1RM, if we take that to failure, that produces the same amount of growth as we would if we did 30% with blood flow restriction. The blood flow restriction just makes you do less work, right? But And so the kind of the recommendation off of that is for a lot of these muscle adaptations, vascular stuff is a little bit different. But a lot of these muscle adaptations, if you just do go to failure, adding blood flow restriction probably isn't doing too much other than reducing the amount of work that you have to do. But I think one of the things that we were interested in is at some point, you probably decrease the load so much that you can actually induce failure. Meaning that if I reduce it to 10%, 15%, and I had them do as many repetitions as they could, they may never actually reach failure because the force of contraction is probably so small that you don't actually impede blood flow via the contraction, meaning that you can go on for a long period of time. So we've done a little bit of work with that, trying to see if doing very, very low loads by themselves and with different levels of blood flow restriction and comparing that to high load exercise. So we should have some stuff coming out, hopefully in the next year or so related to that. We've looked at the adaptations to muscle size and strength. We also looked at kind of the more of the vascular side. So acute changes in blood flow and then the chronic changes and non-invasive measures of capillarization and venous compliance. So that's one of the things that we've just wrapped up. And then the other is it's ongoing, but we're kind of interested in, again, still this muscle size and strength thing with the model of where we minimize muscle growth in one condition and we maximize it in another, and we look at, changes in strength. So we've made a couple tweaks to the study design to try and make it a little bit more solid. And we're trying to get a pretty big sample for that. So those are two of the big things that we're working on right now. And then we're doing some, short-term kind of blood flow restriction, just kind of methodological questions. So those are all the things that finishing up are kind of ongoing in our lab.
Cool. Sounds good. Last time we spoke, you ran through your training protocol with me, which was very interesting. Is it still the same type of thing you're doing, growing the deadlift and a couple workouts a week with a few sets to failure? Is that?
Yeah. So couple times a week, actually one time per week, I do my little glide on the elliptical, where people make fun of me, but I like the elliptical. And then I take my casual strolls around campus. At the University of Mississippi, we have a beautiful campus. So take my daily stroll through that. And outside of that, lifting weights, I basically do kind of a circuit a couple times a week. I don't even monitor the load. I just put it on something and I do it as many times as I want to. So getting pretty close to failure on a couple sets twice per week on the on kind of the major muscle groups. And then I deadlift, twice a week where I work up to kind of, a heavy single, and I do that twice a week. And that's basically kind of my workout program. So nothing too elaborate, very simple, and very, very short.
And last time you were doing pulling a 610-pound deadlift, have you managed to exceed that at all?
No, I haven't. I think that, it's one of those things where when I did 610, it honestly felt like that was physically probably some of the most that my body can withstand. I did 615, but I kind of lost my balance at the top. So I can't in good conscience count that as a lift. But I think that my deadlift probably centers around on most days, probably between 540 and 585. I think on very good days, I can do 600, maybe 610, but I do think that that's pretty close, to the most that I can probably withstand, given my structure. But I'm still working with the attitude that I can get stronger.
That's it.
But I still enjoy it, but I think that, it's tough because, this past semester, actually about the past year, we were working on kind of 4 dissertations at once. And then last semester it was 5 dissertations at the same time. So, the stress of that with obviously that takes my priority over my exercise. So to be honest, my training in the past year has been kind of mediocre at best, because it's just not something that's it takes a priority. Obviously I still do it, but my students take my top priority when it comes to stuff like that.
Yeah, so you plan your workouts around your life as opposed to your life around your workouts, like some people still do.
Yeah, and for some people, that, if that's what they really, really, really like, for me, my job and working with my students is what I really, really, really like. And then when I have time, that's when I go up and do the workout. So
Cool. And I'm guessing like you probably still maintain muscle mass from like bodybuilder days on, doing what you do. Would that be accurate? Would you say you've lost anything?
I think that I probably have. I think part of that is that I've had some knee and some back issues, so I don't really train squats or lower body.
Okay.
So I definitely have lost some mass there, but I think I've maintained a decent amount. But I think that I do so little volume work, or even maybe one set twice a week on a couple exercises, that I think I maintain a good portion of it. But to say that I haven't lost anything, I think would probably be probably a lie.
Interesting.
My strength is the highest it's ever been in my life, to be honest.
Awesome. This is a totally random question, but I had to ask you. It's on Twitter. I keep seeing you do these tweets with like number/number, like 15/16, 16/17. How does that even mean?
Yeah, so I like counting. So basically at ACSM I have two talks. So basically, it's just kind of my way of centering myself to make sure that I'm ready for the talk. Make sure that I kind of have a countdown to that. But I have the one talk that we described, which was frequency. And then I have a talk the next day where I'm having a discussion with Professor Folland on muscle growth does or does not contribute to strength in response to resistance exercise. So it's just a countdown to those talks. And the frequency talk I'm excited about, but I'm definitely more excited about my discussion with Professor Folland, because I think it'll make for a good talk. I think that kind of the format is I'm going to talk for 20 minutes on why I don't think muscle growth plays a role with increasing strength with resistance training, and then he's going to talk for 20 minutes on why he thinks it does. And then we're going to have 10 minutes for questions, kind of maybe thoughts on how to better answer this question. So I'm really looking forward to it. I think Professor Folland's done a lot of good work, and I think that it'll be a nice kind of academic discussion about this topic.
Yeah, that's really good, and it's nice to see that kind of productive debate that's done in a mature way. I just realized, I was kind of saying like, I don't want you to spoil the ACSM talk, but then I realized this would come out like 2 months after anyway, so it doesn't even matter. But that only just occurred to me. Jeremy, so much fun as always. Really appreciate you taking the time. What's the best way for the listeners to find out more about you and look at your material?
I think Twitter, and is at JP Loenneke. So at JP LOENNEKE. I use the same handle for Instagram, where I share a lot of our stuff. But I would say more often than not, the best way to communicate with me is on Twitter, for sure. That's where I share a lot of our stuff and just kind of interact with people who have more questions, or even where I follow along and try to learn some things myself.
And do you have any parting words for the listeners? As I said before, split up mainly between high intensity training hobbyists or strength training hobbyists, and then also strength training entrepreneurs who are keen to understand how they can get the best results and motivate their clients. So is there any kind of parting last words or parting thoughts you have for those people?
Yeah, I think with respect to muscle growth, I'll just talk about a few things. I think muscle growth, it really comes down to preference. And I think that's really good news for, people who are interested in doing different types of workouts. So maybe some people don't like to do squats, but they still want to increase muscle size. So have them do the hack squat or have them do the leg extension or whatever. Or maybe they don't like to lift heavy. They can lift light and just do a little bit more repetitions. And I think that's key when you're working, for long-term compliance, or when you're working with other people who aren't you. You can say there's some degree of preference here. We can kind of pick and choose what we kind of like to do. With respect to strength, I think that if you're definition of strength is being the best at doing one repetition or doing maximal exertion, then I think that you have to set the program up to where it's very close to that. It doesn't have to necessarily be practicing the 1RM as I do, but I think that if you're entering a powerlifting competition and you're not spending a large portion of your time lifting near the 1RM, then you're going to lose that competition. So I think that being strong is very specific to the load and very specific to the movement. And I think that muscle growth is you get a wide range. Now, I think just in general, a general comment for everyone is just kind of remain skeptical. And I think about everything. And I think that you have to always kind of question your own thinking, meaning, am I saying this is better because it's actually better? Am I saying this is superior because it's actually superior, or is it just because I like to do that? And we have to stop doing that, because that's what we've done with periodization, etc. So periodization is fine to do, but that's, again, very different than saying that it's actually superior to just progressive overload. And I think that we have to move past this kind of discussion of, well, I read this in a textbook. Well, that doesn't necessarily make it true, unfortunately. So I think that we have to, when someone comes out with a new idea, I think it's important to be very skeptical of that. When I come out and say, I don't think that muscle growth contributes to strength, you should be very skeptical of that comment, but open to the discussion and open to see why does this individual think that, right? Where are they drawing that from? So I think that we get too close-minded and we get into these silos, and I think we have to stop doing that. And we have to be open to actual discussion and not what I see on social media, where it's ridiculous, the kind of the communication that people have, where if somebody thinks something a little bit different, they're all of a sudden a moron, or they're an idiot, or all of this. That is not good for discussion. That makes no sense. So I think we have to be very skeptical of new things, but open to them. And I think that we have to be able to have discussions. And if someone can't have that discussion, well, then just stop talking to them. We're not going to get anything useful from that. So that's me rambling, but that's kind of what I would say.
No, I love it. And I think it's funny, on social, you just see a lot of people who, they see something and they feel so threatened by it because it threatens what they thought was the most effective fill in the blank for so many years, whether it's diet or exercise or whatever, to achieve some certain goal. And especially if they have a business that's invested in that, or they have skin in the game in some way, or reputation, people get incredibly defensive and threatened. So it is very challenging. And I think some of the most productive domains are, like you were just saying earlier, the debate you're having with one of your colleagues. I think that's great, So yeah, it's that's good to see. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining me again. And to all the listeners, to find the blog post for this episode, or the show notes, please go to corporatewarrior.co/Jeremy. And for all other episodes, please go to corporatewarrior.co/podcast. And until next time, guys, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Before you head off, head on over to corporatewarrior.co/ebook to get your free high-intensity training Google Sheet to track your training progress. And get my ebook with 20 interview transcripts with some of my top guests, including Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Bay, and Bill Day Simone, on how to optimize muscle gain, fat loss, and overall health in an efficient, effective, and sustainable way. Head on over to corporatewarrior.co/ebook now and enter your email address for instant access.